thank everyone, all the panelists for joining today for our first webinar of this March APS year. I suppose that's the best way of putting it. So it's weird annual year windows. Chris Lynn is going to lead a webinar moderated on navigating the transition from graduate school to postdocs. As many of you participants know, that these webinars have been a series that we've been running for a few years now, and you can access them on our website, and they're all available on YouTube, so you can go back in time and see the interesting topics that were previously discussed. And so we try to add some more topics that were not represented before in this year's webinar series, but we'll have a fewer of those because we've covered quite a bit already. Yeah, so this was something that there was a lot of interest in it, and that's why we have these amazing panelists today to discuss about their experiences. And I welcome all of you to participate as well, ask questions, and make this a very sort of active discussion about all the questions you have and all the sort of topics that is on your mind of how to transition from graduate school to postdocs or other things that may be on your mind. With this, I'll give the floor to Chris, and he'll take it from there.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Armida. And thank you to everyone that's showing up. We'll probably still have some more people trickling in. So yeah, today we're going to try to talk about this sort of confusing transition that is kind of poorly defined from PhD student to postdoc, which I feel like at the beginning, I mean, I feel like your whole academic life leading up to a postdoc, everything is pretty well defined, and there's like specific applications and deadlines, and you also likely have people applying to the same places, so you can like ask them for advice. But then the moment you're like graduating with your PhD, there's a whole world in front of you that feels difficult to navigate. And a lot of people don't stay in academia, but for those that want to stay in academia, the postdoc is almost always like the next, at least in biophysics, the next logical step. But there's all sorts of different postdocs. There isn't like one set deadline with a bunch of applications, and it feels disorganized. And actually that just carries on for the rest of your life, I think. So as far as I can tell. So I think this will be really helpful, hopefully for grad students thinking about starting a postdoc. And we have an awesome set of panelists at each stage of with knowledge, recent knowledge at each stage of this process. And so yeah, I guess we'll start by I'd like each of my panelists to sort of, well, actually, let me take a step back. So the way that we'll kind of organize this is I'm just gonna ask some questions of the panelists, and then hopefully we'll hear from each of them about what they think. If people in the crowd ever have questions, just feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, ask a question. Yeah, it can be, this is meant to be like we're all sitting in a room together, and you can ask any questions you want. So I have enough questions planned for like 30 to 40 minutes of time roughly, and then we can just open it up to questions from anyone else. But if you have questions along the way, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Cool. So the first thing is I'd just like each of my panelists to introduce themselves and talk about like where they are in their academic lives, and what sort of research they're interested in studying. And then specifically for this panel, like what is your sort of recent experience thinking about this transition from grad school to postdoc? So maybe we can start with Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steph Palmer. I'm a professor here at the University of Chicago. I'm both in a biology department and in the physics department. My PhD was in theoretical condensed matter physics, and I switched pretty dramatically into neuroscience for my postdoc. And when I applied for fellowship postdocs. I applied for condensed matter theory postdocs, both in Europe, Israel, and the US. And at the end of the day, I took the one neuroscience theory postdoc that I was offered, and that one was a completely different interview process to all the others. So I'm happy to talk about any and all of those, that nuance, and I think some of it's still relevant today, though that was a while ago now, I will admit.
But you do also read a lot of applications, so you have a useful
Oh yeah, I
perspective
sit
on
I sit on the other side of the table a lot.
So
I feel like
you're the one with expertise on the other side, with
Yeah.
the keys to the lock.
I will tell you all the secrets.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
And then maybe maybe Caroline.
Yeah. So I'm Caroline. I am a postdoc at Harvard. I've been here for like maybe getting close to a year, I guess. I did my PhD in doing exclusively theory work in a physics department, mostly thinking about neuroscience and neuroscience adjacent things. But in my postdoc, I'm actually working much more on genetics and on evolution. And I'm actually also have switched from doing exclusively theory to a mix of experiment and theory. So it's been a big shift. Yeah, and I'm at the stage of, settling in still, I'd say, and getting my hands around an entirely new system.
Jason.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Jason. I'm a postdoc over at Cornell. I did my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. I studied a wide smattering of things from metamaterials to neuroscience. In general, I'm interested in the physics of how neural systems work and do all the interesting things that biological and artificial ones do. So my PhD, I spent a lot of time thinking about how the biological ones kind of did it. And so now in my postdoc, I'm thinking more about how the artificial ones kind of work. And I'm, maybe a little over 2 years in.
Nice. And Matthew.
Hey, I'm Matthew. I'm a grad student at Simon Fraser University, which is just outside of Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. I'm just finishing up my PhD. I actually just submitted my thesis 10 days ago to the day, so that's exciting. I kind of work generally on applying thermodynamics and statistical physics to biological systems, and in particular, my PhD was on kind of developing and applying tools from stochastic thermodynamics to study energy conversion in biological molecular machines. As far as where I'm at stage-wise, one of the reasons that I think Chris asked me to be on this panel is I just went through the postdoc application process over the winter and have a position at Yale in the Department of Physics and Quantitative Bio Institute that I'll be starting in November. So really excited for that.
And yeah, maybe I also forgot to introduce myself, so maybe I should introduce myself also. So I'm Chris. Chris Lin. I'm a new assistant professor at Yale in the physics department and also the Quantitative Biology Institute. So yeah, excited to have Matthew joining us next year. And yeah, I study stat mech and information theory applied to the brain. And I guess in my transition, so I did my PhD at Penn, and then I applied for a bunch of the fellowships that we might talk about that later. Got some, didn't get others, and through a random process ended up at Princeton. And yeah, now I'm here. So I think a good way to start it off is right with the most important things, which is so for each of you, what do you think the most important 1 or 2 or 3 things are to be thinking about in the front of your mind when you're starting to think about doing a postdoc? And yeah, whoever feels inspired can, if you have anything you want to say.
Well, I think that just to kick things off, I think that there are 2 things to consider, to my mind, that are most important. What do you want to change? And what do you want to do long term? So what do you want to do that's different from what you did in your PhD? And how do you get those skills and training or experience or just somebody fun to work with. And then the second thing is think ahead always to the next career transition stage. So if you're gunning for a faculty position, how does your postdoc suit that goal and help bring you to that path? So be really heads up about what you want to do after. If you're thinking about other career paths, also think about like, how does this potential postdoc, or how will your postdoc serve you in your future career? So if you want to go into industry, you might want to make sure you go to a place where people have placed people in industry in the kind of subdomain you want to go. You want to look really critically at how your potential mentors have done placing people. And, you know, you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you.
Anyone else have any thoughts on what they think is important? I think the reason I brought y'all together is because you have, you're coming at it from very different perspectives and stages. So I guess as someone in a postdoc, what do you think you now think is important to look for in a postdoc, Jason and Caroline?
Like one thing Stephanie mentioned that I think is maybe worth emphasizing is the importance of a good and supportive environment, which means a mentor who, like Stephanie mentioned, who is supportive and probably ideally has also a track record of supporting their postdocs throughout the entire transition from being a graduate student to starting their faculty position. But it also means like the community that surrounds you, which will be the other people in the group or the other postdocs or the group or the other groups nearby. I think a lot of people sometimes get focused on like exactly the science they want to do and picking the person who has the coolest recent paper and the thing they want to work on, for example. But like your ability to do science depends so much on who you're working with. And you need that support for that period in your career. So yeah, I would really emphasize the importance of that.
Yeah, I would I would double down on that a little bit too. I'll say it a little differently, and maybe I'm a little. I mean, this is maybe right or this may be wrong, but one thing I think is important to look for is to find someone who's a good person, and that's very vaguely defined. But throughout your postdoc, the things you're interested in are going to change. The things that you think you might want to do might change. A lot of things are kind of unknown and up in the air. And what you want is someone who's going to be, supportive through a lot of those things, right? Nothing goes according to plan. So someone who's flexible, someone who's supportive, and exactly along those lines. Something to look for is other resources in the university or in the department. Like who else can you collaborate with? What resources do you have access to? What resources do you have to kind of outsource and go elsewhere to look for? That might be expertise in a particular field or domain or a particular method or technique. Having all of those things in-house or having more of those things in-house will make things just much smoother and more productive. And last thing, harkening back to something that I think Stephanie mentioned, you want balance between how much you want to stretch yourself and how much you want to tap into the skills that you've already developed, because you don't kind of want to go in blind being like, oh, I'm going to do something completely different and I have no idea how it contributes to the narrative of my trajectory. Maybe you do. You also don't want to do the same exact thing that you have been doing for your PhD, right? Because then as a scientist, you kind of grow less. So those kind of were three things.
Cool. And yeah, I guess Matthew, you can be like, I guess the voice of grad student current, and like, so I think what might be interesting for people is like what you were like the general types of things you were considering when you were thinking about applying to different places for your postdoc, and so you don't have the benefit of hindsight.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So I guess, yeah, when I started out kind of deciding what places to apply to, it was kind of a combination of looking for good fits in terms of research area. So I kind of had a few directions that I was interested in going in research-wise. And so I was looking for people who I thought would be really exciting to collaborate with, and looking for fellowships that would give me a lot of independence to kind of have freedom to choose what I want to do and how I want to do it. A few things, though, that I think I learned throughout the application process that I didn't know going into it that are maybe interesting is, one of the things that ended up being pretty important for my decision making that I hadn't thought about at all was sort of what's available at a given institution in terms of sort of in-house collaborators or other people that aren't the one or two faculty members or collaborators that you really want to work with. So if you're a theorist, are there experimentalists down the hall that you can potentially talk to and get data from? Or if you're an experimentalist, are there theorists in a nearby building that you can talk to if you run into a problem? And that ended up being something really important to me as I was considering a few different options. The other thing I would say is I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to visit a couple different institutions in person and kind of just meet with dozens of people at each place and just talk to people. And I think I was really able to get a sense, I think anyway, I haven't had a chance to verify this yet, but was able to get a sense of sort of what the culture is like at a few different places. And that was ultimately something that played a pretty big role in my decision process.
Very cool. Well, I think this naturally leads to the next question, which is, so what, after you sort of put together the things that you think you value in your search for a postdoc, and you think you found a few places that you think you'd fit well and you like the advisor, how do y'all think the best way to go about trying to talk to that advisor is, or get on their radar, or try to see if it's feasible to even do a postdoc with someone once you think you have identified a few options?
Email works.
Yeah.
I emailed people. I mean, there's lots of answers, but I talked to some people at a conference. I pulled aside and I asked them if they were hiring, and I talked to them in person. But some people I'd never met, and I wasn't going to run into them in a conference, and I just emailed them. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Sometimes you'll get the answer back, which is that they're not hiring, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the email route did not exactly work. I emailed a bunch of people, and I emailed them again, and my response rate was maybe like 5% for emails, like people who actually replied to my email. And so maybe my recommendation might be a little complementary to that, which is in the context of their work, right? These faculty members, I imagine, are getting many emails of potential postdoc applicants. And so how one might choose to approach that advisor is to not come off like you're looking for just a postdoc, but like the postdoc with that person. And a strong way to do that is, at a seminar that person is giving, or maybe talk to them at a conference after that person has given the talk. And so the more in context you can make your interactions, the more you'll kind of stand out to them, I think.
I think it's good behavior on the PI side to answer every reasonable email you get, because sometimes you get things that are, somebody asking to do experimental chemistry with you, and it's clear that there are 300 people on the email list, and you're like, well, do I even need to reply to this? This just doesn't fit. This doesn't make any sense. And sometimes I reply to even those, but I think anything that's reasonable, at least giving some reply, is good. Obviously not everybody does that, so I agree completely with Jason that you want to sort of contextualize it for the person you're writing to. I think another good strategy, which I have done for some of my students, is to write privately to the person they're reaching out to before they reach out, saying, hey, I have a stellar grad student. They're going to reach out to you. Their name is blah. Expect an email. I think they're outstanding. If you have room to talk to them, I think it's worth your while. And so asking your grad student advisor to advocate for you is completely reasonable and can, you know, grease the wheels. Right analogy? Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
jump in and also add that, yeah, I've definitely made use of that strategy. And my advisor offered and said kind of like, okay, like pick your top 3 or 4 places and I'll reach out to someone I know there and kind of make sure that I do what I can to get you a foot in the door. And I think that was very helpful. The other thing I'd add is just, you know, when you're actually talking to a prospective postdoc supervisor, you know, things you want to think about are kind of striking a balance between showing interest in what they're doing and showing that you have ideas of your own and potential directions that would sort of use the expertise you've developed in your PhD to take their research in a new direction, but also maybe use their expertise to take your research in a new direction. I think the key is really showing that like you are an independent scientist with ideas of your own that you'll be able to contribute.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I might also chime in a little bit with well, my own biased, self-interested perspective, which is that I think a lot of people's I guess this is an answer to like the last 2 questions for myself a little bit, is just a small nugget, is that I think a lot of people's first instinct is to want to work with the most famous people whose papers they read and things like this, and whose names come up everywhere. But there's likely, I mean, I haven't done a study on this, but I would hazard to guess that the rate of email responses from those people is anti-correlated with like I don't know, name recognition or perhaps age or other things like that. And so one thing to consider is looking at sort of younger faculty who you think might be interested. I think my experience is that younger faculty are more likely to reply to emails, and if you do a postdoc with them, might be more likely to spend more time on you. And this is something I didn't really think about when I was applying, when I was thinking about postdocs. It just didn't really occur to me. But I think that's another perhaps strategy for getting more more responses.
Could I mention one more thing on top of that?
Yeah.
Sorry. So something that I actually realized later on, and other people may have realized this way earlier, and I was just slow, is that just because the research field and topic sound and look the same, doesn't necessarily mean that the value proposition of the work of the lab is the same. So, you know, there's like what the work is about and the field and what they study, but then there's at the end of the day like what's very interesting to the PI, right? And the lab in general, and those 2 things are sometimes not the same, right? The value proposition might be deeper or in some sense kind of unrelated to the actual subject matter. So when looking through the papers, it might not be enough just to be doing the same kinds of things on the same systems, but actually like really, what is the kind of understanding? What is the kind of differential advantage that this lab is going after? And like showing that you have a handle on that, which means you have to look through like, you know, 5 or 10 different papers to kind of understand that field, might help set you apart.
Very cool. Yeah, I totally agree. So we've kind of like touched on a little bit that there's this notion of postdoc fellowships, but then also you can just you can email mentors, you could write them a letter if you wanted, you could just show up and knock on their door. There's all sorts of ways to like get in contact with like potential places where you might do a postdoc. And there seems to be this pretty big distinction between sort of applying for postdoc fellowships versus versus a more traditional route where you talk to the people and then see if they have funding to bring you on to do the research you want to do, or that they want to do, or
Chris.
maybe you can agree.
Chris, I don't know the background of the people listening. It might be good for you to give like a few sentences on what these fellowships you're talking about are.
Yeah. So I guess the only semi-organized, like the only thing that feels in any way related to applying to like grad school or college or all these other sort of organized ways of doing things are what are known as broadly like postdoc fellowships. Even though even these are not as nicely organized as like grad school applications, because there's different deadlines. You just have to search to see if different schools have these. So the main idea is that these postdoc fellowships, I think generally that there's exceptions to everything I'm about to say, but generally I think the idea is that they're meant to give you a bit more independent freedom in your research. So that they basically are a pot of money to fund your postdoc, which means that you're not directly funded from a PI's grant usually. And then this ideally this is supposed to give you a bit more intellectual freedom, a bit more freedom to collaborate across different PIs, maybe even different universities. And it's also a sort of organized way to apply. You get it or you don't. And if you get it, then there's sort of an organized route into that university, basically. There's also some fellowships that are not specifically tied to a specific university. They're from like foundations, and then you can take them to different universities. And I don't actually know of a good list where these all exist. So that would be a good thing for someone to do. It's just like,
It would be nice to have a list. I was actually saying you could just list some of them right now, but we could get long. And so there are ones that are tied to particular institutes at particular universities. There are fancy things like the Harvard Society of Fellows, which is across all disciplines and then gives you that freedom. There are things that are tied to, say, a physics frontier center. The physics frontier centers all typically have postdoc fellowships that are in that theme of that particular center. And they're usually, I think, there's a steady state of 5 or 6 physics frontier centers funded by the NSF all over the country at any given time. And then there are some university fellowships that might be also across disciplines where, there's usually at some universities, some kind of presidential fellowship from the president of the university that is to recruit talent to that university. And that can be across disciplines. So searching around and finding what these are. And there are some that you've heard of, like Harvard Society of Fellows and things like that, and others that you might not know about. So actually having a resource for APS resource for this would be really
maybe this is
helpful.
something I can talk to APS DBIO about and try to. It would be good to put together a list of these. Are you saying, Caroline?
I was going to say also separately, another set of things that people call fellowships that is relevant for people in DBIO is in biology, there's a whole other class of fellowships, which are usually mentored. That's probably overall more relevant for experimentalists. I think they're more common to go to like their biology fellowships, and so they're maybe overall, if I had to guess, a little more skeptical of theorists. But there's a whole bunch of these. There's private foundation ones. There's some from NSF. There's a whole bunch through NIH. And it's a whole other world. Usually those come with a mentor. So you apply with a mentor, but it's not uncommon for people to apply to those things before they start a postdoc with the idea that like somebody who maybe doesn't have money might want to hire you. And if you get a fellowship, you would go to that person. So that's just
with the advantage that you actually then sit down with that person and think really hard and long about what your project plans should be, and you develop them together. And this could be for like an F32 and NRSA NIH fellowship. There are ones through lots of different places. Sorry, now I'm trying to make the list in my head and say it out loud quickly, which is hard.
I think there's an NSF one also for postdocs.
There is an NSF one. But the NSF one is very targeted. I think they pick specific fields each year. And so it's very specific.
And then there's
you go, Jason. Just to piggyback off of that a little bit, the university level ones, there's actually like weird pots of money scattered around universities in different departments that like might be good to bring up in your conversation with your potential postdoc advisor, because you know, there are some lesser known pots of money that are maybe easier to get or higher chances of getting, that are specifically geared towards something like interdisciplinary that, you know, you're not competing with everyone in the world for, but you know, just the people in that department, that university for. But these are not advertised really, so they exist, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point from Jason. So even if you don't see a specific fellowship, like, so even if you're just reaching out to a potential advisor and you're talking to them, it's always I think it's always a good idea to ask, like, well, are there little pots of money at your university that like fellowships that I might not know about online that we could apply for together? And then that shows them that you're like thinking practically, and it will also just like open the door to talking more about what research you would want to work on, and just keeps the conversation going. And often, like Jason said, there are like universities often have money for different sorts of postdoc fellowships that you might not be able to just see online. And I guess generally, I guess to give a general sense of the structure, at least in my experience, these, if you're planning to graduate, let's say at the end of the spring, which I think is end of the spring or summer or something, which I think is when most people tend to graduate, then the application cycle is sort of like any other like grad school and stuff. So there's like postdoc fellowships applications start like sometime in the summer before, and then most of them are due sometime in the fall before you would like to start, like if you'd like to start the next fall. And so I think honestly, right around now, if you're thinking of graduating in like a year from now would be the time to get online and just, I think I mean, I don't know if I can speak for everyone, but what I did is just like, you just gotta just Google different universities you're interested in, or look up postdoc fellowships in the specific field you're interested in, and try to come up with your own list. But yeah, maybe I can try to work to put a list together to get online.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here because I see someone from the Q&A has asked about what an organized list for these fellowships. Yeah, the answer is that there isn't one. I can't speak for everyone, but personally, I found out about most of these from just talking to people who are a couple of years ahead of me in career stage at conferences and sort of asking them where they'd applied, and sort of made a list by cross-referencing a bunch of different conversations with different people. But even still, despite sort of putting a lot of effort into trying to find out about these, there are a bunch that I just never heard of until after the application deadline. So for example, Stephanie mentioned the Harvard Society of Fellows. I heard about that 3 months after the deadline closed, for example. So there's, I think, a list, some kind of organized list would be a pretty valuable resource for grad students.
The difficulty is that that list always changes. Like the postdoc fellowships that I hear about that become available or become unavailable, it's like a yearly kind of thing. So
yeah,
it seems yeah, it's an interesting problem.
Yeah, I could try to put together a current list, and then it might change. Like for example, the fellowship I had is no longer exists, which is a shame. But yeah. Well, I guess so. This was leading into, yeah, that was a good point, Caroline. Like just explaining what these fellowships are. And I guess this leads to a question for people here, or I mean, at least for ones that have thought about these fellowships, how, like, if you have any advice or tips for people thinking about applying for these fellowships, because for a lot of grad students, they might not have thought about. It's similar in some sense to applying for a grant. In some sense, it is a grant. And I think a lot of maybe grad students haven't thought about applying for grants before. And so if you have any sort of advice about sort of tips for applying for these things.
Absolutely. I'll say a few words and then let others chime in who have been on the other side of the table. What you typically need for these kinds of applications are 2 to 3 reference letters. So think about who you'd ask, and think carefully about who you'd ask, and who might write the most detail about what you've done. Obviously, your advisor is one, and then think about other people you've chatted with about ideas for that. And if you haven't done that, think ahead of time about maybe starting those conversations so that somebody can speak in depth about what you've done. You don't want sort of a generic faculty member. I don't know. Like Carl faculty, I don't know, to write about you. You know, somebody that you've really sort of shared your own vision with, or you know, you've talked to about your project as it's developed. Then you need a CV. Make sure it's clean and easy to read and 2 pages. And you'll need typically a cover letter, a research statement, and a research statement. And the research statement is going to cover what you've done and what you'd like to do. And so you have to think pretty carefully about how you say what was the importance of your thesis project, what was the gap in knowledge that your work filled, how did you do it, how did you come to the conclusions you got, what's the kind of oomph that you got out of it, and then what do you want to do next. And it doesn't have to be down to the level of a grant proposal, but it should be somewhat well developed, a little bit more developed than, I think I'd like to work, so just to give an example from my own past, you know, I think I'd like to work on the brain because that sounds cool. That's fine as a start, but you want to develop that a little bit further and have some ideas about why your expertise from before connects to this thing you want to do. And always putting it in the context of the place you're applying to. So if you're applying to an institute, a center, a group of people who have formed a collective that are hiring a postdoc, you will want to say something that will resonate with those people who are going to be the folks reading your application. Either to say, this is done here, and I will bring this new special sauce to that mix, and here's why it would be interesting to talk to y'all. Or I think like this connects things that are going on here, or you know, you have this research theme and I'm totally into that research theme, and this is how I think I could contribute to that. So making that, giving yourself time to develop that well ahead of time is a very, very good idea. And the season for these things is kind of late summer, fall to winter. So getting that sort of on your radar early in summer, late in spring is a good idea, so you can start thinking it through. And I know we have somebody here, Caroline, who I know did a fantastic job of iterating over drafts and giving the drafts to lots of people to get feedback, and was pretty fearless about that. And that was really good behavior, like basically putting your cards out there and saying, oh, how does this look? And enough time that you could say, no, that didn't hit it. You could say, okay, back to the drawing board and do it again. And what Caroline wrote was awesome. So it wasn't too hard, but you know, that is good practice and helps you prepare for these things. Oh, and thinking really, really carefully about building your CV, because nothing is easier than getting an app where you're like, oh, papers, nice, easy. I can see what was done and mark the progress in the PhD. If you don't have any pubs, it gets, you know, you're sort of at then a little bit, it depends a little bit more on how much that reader on the other side of the table is willing to like dig into what your letter writer said and what your research statement said, and what the potential is if they don't have a piece of work that's been kind of vetted by the community to look at and evaluate. So do yourself the favor, as much as you can, of having something on the archive, something published. Think ahead about the last year of your PhD as being a place where you want to have some of that work marked down in the kind of external view.
I wanted to give a slightly different piece of advice about these, which I think is just worth stating, which is also think about if you actually want one of these fellowships.
Yes.
They're very prestigious, and so I think people apply to them because it feels like you should apply to the prestigious thing. But they're also independent, which has a lot of downsides. So like, for example, I changed direction quite dramatically between my PhD and my postdoc. And if I didn't have a mentor who was sort of very supportive and guiding me through the fairly significant change, I would honestly be like quite lost. And so, you know, going back to what I think Stephanie said at the very beginning, which is the thing is to think about like what you want to keep the same and what you want to change between your postdoc and your PhD. Think about what you want to work on and how much independence is actually a good idea for you want to work on, right? It's also nice to have another senior person to learn a whole bunch of stuff from. And how much mentorship you get at different fellowships varies a lot depending on the fellowship. But yes, just putting that out there. Just because it's prestigious doesn't mean you should take it or you should do it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point from Caroline, is that one thing to consider when you're thinking about applying for these fellowships is sort of being self-reflective about whether or not you think you would enjoy having a more independent position, because there are a lot of pros to getting these fellowships, like prestige, and it looks good on your CV and things like that. But there are also cons, which is that if you have an independent position, the pro is that you have freedom to think about things, but the sort of glass half empty there is that there isn't always a PI who feels responsible for you and who will come to bat for you. Whereas if you are on one of their grants, it's in their like certain interests that you move along and get things done. Whereas if you're not on their grants, then it's all kind of up to you. And for some people, that's great. But some people, like Caroline is saying, if you're in a different situation, or you just feel like you would rather have a more dedicated advisor, then maybe these fellowships aren't the right thing to do. And there's no right answer. So either way is it's unique to each person.
Yeah, I think I would give that same advice. I found the same to be true, is that you get a lot of freedom, but you don't necessarily have someone who's invested. And so in some sense, unless you are established and happy enough to write single author papers or papers on your own, you do have to work with someone. Someone does have to, pay the publication fees, unless the postdoc fellowship does that for you, right? And you also want to learn, right? You don't necessarily, like, the postdoc isn't a position where you're now already kind of know everything that you're going to know. You want to grow, right? And so in order to grow, you need someone to invest in, you need someone to teach you. So my advice would be, if you are looking for a postdoc fellowship, try to make sure as best you can that you do have someone there who has stated reasonably explicitly that they would like work with you kind of primarily. Not that they would fund you, not that they would be as invested as if they were paying you on their grant, but just you're there trying to learn, and nobody necessarily has to give you the time of day if you're not doing what they're interested in, right? So there's this interesting balance between freedom and exploring your own interests, but also compromising and making sure that you're, you have someone to work with.
Cool. We got a question from the chat, which is so if you feel like you're not getting enough responses and you only have like one or two options on the table, how do you try not to make compromises and rush to a decision? It's a tough question, but if anyone feels like they have advice on that.
I think Caroline said it well in a different context when she said, make sure you want the position. So if you feel like you're compromised, the way to start this would be to say, don't apply for a postdoc you don't think you'd actually want. So the way you could get yourself into this is you have a kind of I guess it's the same advice as if you're applying for undergrad, make sure your safety school is a place you'd actually go.
Mhm.
And I guess the same advice goes here, but
But that can be hard,
yeah,
right?
that can
Like,
be
you can
hard.
also-
Yeah.
Right, like there's lots of, it's very possible to apply to a postdoc and very reasonably think this is a person I'd be happy working with, and they interview you and you talk to the person and it's just not a good fit.
Right.
Or it's not that good of a fit.
Right.
Um,
Right.
So like even if you do your due diligence, it is possible to find yourself in a place where you're not excited about the offer.
Right. And then if that's your one offer, so what it I guess
Mm.
this then comes down to like, well, what if you know, you could be crunched because you might not have the option of just extending your PhD. So I guess this speaks to applying early for postdocs or filling out these waters early, which is again a hard thing. So I don't know, maybe I should let other people talk who are closer to this.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in there.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to be in a position where I had the opportunity to apply sort of 8 months, or to apply for positions starting with a start date 8 months before my PhD funding ran out. And so that put me in the position of being able to, basically, if I hadn't gotten a fellowship that I was excited about, I would have just done another year of PhD and applied again in the next cycle. And I know that's, not a position that everyone will be able to be in, but to the extent that you can apply early and put yourself in that position where you have another shot or another application cycle, I think that's a really valuable kind of fallback option to be able to give yourself. With the obvious caveat that it really depends on the kind of circumstances of your PhD program.
I think it depends a bit on what like the compromise you think you're making is. Like sometimes it's nice to have options, but if you just feel like you'd rather have more options for the sake of being able to choose among options, that's one thing. Versus if you're thinking like, I mean, you have to, this is a thinking, I definitely had friends coming out of grad school, for example, who who like ended up in both cases here, right? I have friends who took a postdoc position because they had an offer and it was the offer they had, and it turned out to be not a great situation. And I have friends who took a postdoc position because it was the offer they had and they are doing incredibly and they're very, very happy. If I have to like pinpoint what the difference between those situations are, it's like mostly how good their relationship is with their PI and how supportive the PI is, which is why I mentioned the environment thing earlier. But I think it comes down to some thinking about like, is this not the thing that you want because it's not like the optimal postdoc, or is it not the thing you want? And like, is it still a place where you feel like you'd be able to do science that you're excited about, and it's in a place where you'd be able to live a life that you're happy with all the constraints that comes from, real life. And that's a very personal choice.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that a little bit, I would say that I received a university level postdoctoral fellowship, and it has gone nothing like what I expected. But in some sense, it was incredible because it didn't go at all the way I expected. Right? I learned things that I didn't know that I had to learn, and I realized that the stuff that I had originally thought was very interesting was maybe not as cool as I had originally once thought. So exactly as Caroline was saying, there's kind of this compromise you make of like, oh, is this like, do I have qualms because of like the environment? Do I have qualms because there's not enough like resources or support, or maybe the culture is not very good? Those are kind of absolute, like those are qualms you should very seriously consider and try to look for more options. But if it's more about like research interests and fit, consider giving yourself a little bit more flexibility in terms of gauging what you're interested in, what you'd be willing to be interested in, because that changes, I mean, from the start of your PhD to the end of your PhD, that changes a lot usually. And a postdoc is just another PhD, but you have to do it in half the time and publish more and have a lot more responsibilities, and also have like grant funding potential in those publications for your research program. But it's qualitatively, yeah. So just as a scientist, I recommend some flexibility. It's good to have vision. Nothing's ever gonna go the way that you planned. Yeah.
Cool. Yes, we got another question in the chat. And this might be our last question that we have time for. So one of the attendees is asking, do students from developing countries encounter different funding or visa issues when they're applying to the US for postdocs? Steph, you might have the most insight on this. Yeah. So like basically if
Right.
students, yeah.
So I think that there are some obvious challenges and then some things to know about how to get around it. So challenges is that there are some postdoc routes that can just be for US citizens, but typically actually that's mostly at the grad student phase. And then once you get to postdocs, things open up. And I'm trying to think if I know of particular places that, or particular fellowships that have an
All the
eye on bringing in more. Sorry, say it again, Caroline.
Oh, I'd say all the NIH ones are just US, for example.
Right, but there are
some, so okay, there are targeted fellowships for like postdoctoral fellowships for people from different locations. For example, there's a fellowship for students from Latin America that I know a number of people with, that I think funds about half your salary. I don't know where you're from, but those do exist. There's not an enormous number of them, but they do exist. At least I think the Latin American one is in biology, but this is DBIO. So
yeah, there are those specific ones. I was trying to think about
Yeah, I
the
think at the
citizenship
university
requirements
level,
are not as
yeah. I feel like my experience with things at the university level, and also I think with like just reaching out to advisors, my experience is that there aren't, I mean, I don't think there are usually rules against people from other countries. You might have the typical challenges of language barriers, moving, things like that. But for most, in my experience, I think for most of the fellowships and even normal postdoc route or traditional postdoc route, I don't think there are too many specific barriers to someone from another country.
well,
I just wanted to jump. Okay, sorry.
Go ahead, Steph.
I just want to jump in and say that when Caroline said the NIH NRSA postdoc fellowships are for US citizens only, that doesn't mean that if you're a PI at a US institution with a grant, you can pay an international postdoc. That is not a problem. And it is not a problem for an NSF grant either. So that doesn't mean to say that you can't have NIH funding if you're an international student from a developing country. And I think it would be worth taking this question into a bit of sleuthing to add to that list about particular postdoc opportunities that are targeting regional places around the globe that that have different challenges and recruiting people to US labs.
Nice.
I'll add to one other point there is if you do a PhD, if your PhD is done in not in the US, like I think this conversation has sort of come at the point of how do you get funding, but there's another point, which is getting a postdoc if you are actually coming in with a PhD from a country that maybe has less close ties to the American research institution. I'll throw this out to the rest of the panel. I don't have any good advice about that, but that is another major barrier. That people find different ways around, whether that's by finding postdocs with people who have ties to your home institute, the institution where you did PhD, or something else. I don't know if you have any other points there.
I
Could
think
be a
your
good strategy
papers.
to do a summer program and meet people. There are some summer schools that can be really helpful for networking and taking advantage of any networking opportunity at any meeting you can get to, and finding out what meetings have sort of travel grants for folks coming from developing countries is also good. More and more places have that. Sorry, though, I cut you off, Jason.
Oh, no. Just in that situation, I think your papers probably just matter a little more, because at least my boss reviews lots of applications and requests. And for the most part, paper quality tends to say more about your research caliber than like necessarily where you did your PhD. Because at the point where you're applying for a postdoc, it's kind of like you're a more independent scientist, and so like where you were and what everyone else there was doing is a little less important than who you are, because they're hiring you. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, publications often translate across borders. Awesome. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you to everyone for showing up. I think Stephanie's typing a question to the last answer, so I'll give her time to do that. Yeah, so thank you for everyone for showing up, and I want to give a special thank you to all the panelists for being here today. If anyone here wants to share this with anyone else, it will be online on the DBIO website sometime soon. And yeah, check out the Twitter page. We might tweet out the video. And yeah, so thank you for coming, and yeah, and stay tuned for more webinars like this. There should be one like every other month until March meeting about different topics that we think are interesting for biophysicists and perhaps physicists generally. So yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.